Karina said, my name is Tracy Laliberty, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Zoom presentation today on behalf of our center, the University of Minnesota's College of Education and Human Development, and the School of Social Work. Today's event has been made possible through funds by the United States Department of Health and Human Services and is managed by the Minnesota Department of Human Services Child Safety and Permanency Division. This webinar is the third in a series that we have put together focused on permanency and transition to adulthood for youth in the child welfare system. We typically have an in-person conference every spring. However, due to COVID-19, we were unable to gather that way this past spring. So we feel fortunate that we've got the technology available to us in this country that brings us together virtually so that we can learn from each other, talk with each other, and share this space. I want to start the webinar by acknowledging that our university and where we're broadcasting from is unceded, traditional, ancestral, and contemporary land of the Dakota people, who are the first people of Minnesota Makoche. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and work to hold the university, ourselves, and our partners accountable to American Indian peoples, nations, and our partners. We also acknowledge slavery's deep roots and recognize the significant role that captive and free African Americans have played in building our country, the United States of today. Finally, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to Karina, who you'll hear from in just a moment, Karina Berry, as well as Denise Cooper, Karen Sheehan, and Nora Lee, the CASCW outreach team, for their diligent work over the last few months to bring together this webinar series, as well as our annual publication, the CW 360. Now I'd like to introduce Karina Berry, the Director of Outreach for the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, and she will introduce our speakers.
Miigwech, Tracy, and good morning again, everyone. You heard me a little bit ago. I'll just share a few logistics and then we can get started. If we could all remain muted during the presentation, unless at any point the presenters ask for folks to unmute themselves and answer questions or share thoughts. Otherwise, we will utilize the chat box. And so please feel free to ask questions, add comments, and provide resources and other engagement in the chat box. And we hope to also reserve enough time to, have more Q&A at the end of the presentation, or at any point the presenters can lead the way and let us know how they'd like to move forward. I'm going to send right now in the chat box a link to the rest of the fall webinar series in case you want to tune in to future webinars over the next 3 weeks. We have 3 more coming up, as well as a link to the digital copy of our CW 360 publication that Tracy mentioned, which Bill and another colleague were able to contribute an article to along the lines of this topic and presentation today as well. So we hope you can check that out and feel free to share it with your networks. And we will, following the webinar, we'll follow up with an email with CEUs, copy of the PowerPoint, and a copy of the recorded presentation that you can refer back to and feel free to disseminate and share with your networks. So I think that is it for now. And at this time, I'd like to get us started and allow our presenters to introduce themselves a bit more. And so Bill and Vida, feel free to take it away.
All right, thank you, Corey. I'll go ahead and start. Why don't we do introductions, Vida, and then we'll move into the presentation. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
So I'm Bill Bettencourt. I'm a senior fellow with the Center for the Study of Social Policy. I am someone who's been working in the field of child welfare for over 40 years, 26 years in the public system in San Francisco, retiring as the child welfare director in 2001. And for the past 19 years, I've been working in a variety of capacities to continue to try to transform the system, and both around the area of racial equity and around the improvement of outcomes for LGBT and gender expansive youth. And I lead the getREAL initiative you'll hear about in a minute.
Hi, I'm Vida Khavar. I'm a project director for getREAL California and also for the Youth Acceptance Project in California in Oakland for family builders. I come from a background of about 25 years in child welfare, working from group homes, foster care, adoption, independent living program, et cetera, et cetera. And I was also involved with for those of you who have heard of it, with the RISE project, federal grant that was given to LA LGBT Center to create an evidence-based practice to provide permanency for LGBTQ youth in care in Los Angeles. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and get started. As we think about permanency, and as we talk to you today, we're going to go through talking about the work of getREAL. Vida's going to talk about work around family intervention, trying to keep families together where there are issues that come up around young people's SOGIE. And we'll conclude with kind of some perspectives on where the field is now and the emerging field of abolition and what that means. So for perspective, rather than use the term permanency, we'd like to use the frame of othering and belonging. There is an Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, led by Dr. John Powell. If you want to Google it, it has a lot of good information. And we really like this perspective. This first slide is of Regina King when she won the Oscar in 2019 for her role in If Beale Street Could Talk. And in her acceptance, she said, "As you see, I'm what it looks like when support and love is poured into someone." That was a very powerful statement, we thought, and speaks to what we're talking about here as we think about what do we want for young people in the system. We want support and love poured into them, right? And many of the young people in our system have experienced othering and need belonging. And what does belonging mean? We can assume many things about Regina without having engaged and talked with her. We can assume that she's saying she belonged fully in a family and perhaps in a community that enabled her to navigate a system that's impacted by stigma and oppression. We can look at her and say, well, she's a woman, so she's a misogyny. She's Black, we know that, racism. And as a woman, sexism. But if we were to talk to Regina, we'd want to know how she identifies, how she feels, and what her experiences have been. But those are assumptions we can make. And we can assume that because she had that foundation, she learned how to love herself. She learned how to navigate the world of microaggressions and macroaggressions and how to love and accept who she fully is and to achieve the fullness of what she wanted to achieve and that she continues to achieve. And that is really what this work should be all about. Next slide. So we are a nation founded on othering. I think we are all more and more acutely aware today, certainly within the past 5 years of the history of the country, how it was formed 400 years ago. Black people were brought to the country to become slaves. They were slaves before we had the revolution. Our forefathers were white male property owners, many of whom were slave owners. And they did some very wonderful aspirational things in documents that we know. However, this country was founded on white male supremacy by white male property owners primarily. And the Constitution was designed to ensure that the institution of slavery, which was very important to the economy and to these men, continued. And so we can say that this othering in our country really started with the racism of Black people. We know Indigenous peoples already were being harmed, and there was genocide and other things that happened. But if you think about the structure of the country and how it was crafted around slave ownership, othering began around race and extended to, by implication in history, to women, to LGBT folks, to people with disabilities, anyone who was other than. In fact, early on, Irish and Italian immigrants were othered. And over time, as particularly around the migration of Black people to the North and to the Midwest, that shifted and they became more accepted into the dominant culture through militias and policing and other things. There's lots we can learn from that history, but it's important to look at the framework of how we work with young people in our system, particularly LGBTQ and gender expansive children and youth, around this perspective of othering and belonging, because what we want to get to for young people, if we're really doing our job, is that whole sense of belonging in order to be successful. Go ahead. Our systems are arms of this continuing dominant culture that we've had over time. We have many of us have aspired, thankfully, to make those lofty things that our forefathers put forward to become a reality for everyone. But over time, our systems have, whether intentionally or overtly or however designed, serve to perpetuate the dominant culture, maintaining power and supremacy. So we've had to have people who are poor and families of color have been most impacted by that. Black people in particular and Native people have, we think, been in particular impacted by that over time through all the Indian wars and reservations and tribal agreements that occurred, the removal of Indian children into boarding schools. And the separation of Black children goes all the way back to slavery, separating children to sell them, to maintain control, and to keep that institution moving. So the history of removing children is part of the perspective we have to think about here as the legacy of our time. What we do know is families of color experience public systems, hospitals, schools, and other agencies that are impacted by the bias that we all have living in this country. And they tend to be more likely referred or overrepresented in our system. And, you know, the LGBTQ and gender expansive youth often come to the system because they've been rejected. That is part of sometimes what we call our culture, but it's very heavily influenced by religion and the perpetuation of beliefs that this is wrong and evil and all the other things that happen. And families react by rejecting. Organizations use conversion therapy to try to fix people. All of that is the perspective that we have when we talk about LGBTQ and gender expansive young people. We know that in systems, more often than not, these young people are placed in homes where they do not get that outpouring of support and love that they need for that sense of belonging and that healthy development. And so they bounce from placement to placement, end up in congregate care. And in congregate care, too often, they experience more stigma and harassment because of just how they are designed and exist. And we have all the outcomes around runaway and homeless youth and all that happens on the streets when young people are on the streets. So this is part of our collective look at why we need to do better. And if we're talking about better practice and better ways systems can do work, then we want to certainly get to the place where young people get healthy identity formation and can succeed. Next. So we formed a getREAL initiative about 7 years ago. I spent a year going across the country talking to child welfare professionals, runaway homeless folks, LGBT advocates, and doing multiple foster focus groups with foster youth across the country, most of whom ended up being youth of color, as one would imagine, given our data. And we came about with a role that the Center for the Study of Social Policy and our partners, Family Builder by Adoption and the National Center for Lesbian Rights, could do that we thought would be impactful for the field. And that was to design an initiative to try to transform policy and practice, promoting healthy development, sexual and identity development for all children and youth, with a particular emphasis on why there were unique ways that we needed to make sure we did that for LGBTQ and gender expansive youth. Move on. So getREAL has an acronym that came from all that kind of leads into both practice and systemic change. We spent 6 years in Allegheny County doing field testing of guidelines for managing SOGIE information. The goal of that was to get them to a place where they could, on a routine basis, collect data to inform policy and practice. We knew that in order to do that, the system had to do a whole lot of transformation, because to get to the place of actually collecting good data, they needed to do a better job across the board. And that included us working with every aspect of the system: the courts, lawyers, community agencies, advocates, faith groups, you name it. There was at least a year to 2 years of early work to get folks to have a common language and a common understanding and a common way of looking to move forward and to have buy-in to do that. But what we heard from young people really moved us to the acronym of getREAL. So the first is recognize. And what we heard from young people is they really, aside from the young people who are obvious to you, most of the young people felt invisible in the system, or chose to be invisible in the system because they didn't trust it. And we asked, what would you do if a worker wanted to ask you a question about your sexual orientation? And inevitably, you heard from the focus groups, you could have gay flags in your office, and if that's all you want to know about me, I'm not going to answer you, because I don't trust you in the first place, no matter what. And secondly, if you're not interested in all of who I am, then you really are just viewing me, you're not seeing me. So recognizing was really important. For systems and for environments, that meant you need to have a policy that's visible. You need to have signs all over the place that show you are an agency that recognizes the need to support all young people. You need to have images of people who look like me. In your assessment tools and questions, you need to be asking questions that indicate this is part of what you recognize and talk about. Too often, we can look at policies and documents that come out that never reference race or SOGIE or anything else. They're just kind of generic. Forms don't necessarily identify in a way that I feel they reflect me. Trainings around sexual reproductive health may not include anything about me, and I can zone out as a young person and just not pay attention to them. So we spent time in Allegheny County looking at the environmental scan of all the offices, which did not have anything for anyone who would walk in the door that said, you know anything about me. And they did a lot of work of improving that and putting up visible things around transgender young people, LGBT young people, people of color, images all over, a policy that was more visible. And in offices, there were cubicles where you would see there were cubicles with rainbow emblems on the office. That really meant both for people who came into the office, but also the workers in the office, that these were places you could go to talk to someone about a case to get better input into how you were thinking about it and planning it. So that was a big piece that we did about what we call recognize. Next. The next thing is engage. So Allegheny County said, well, come in and train us. And we said, no, you have people in your community you need to engage with, and your people in your community need to train. And you need to make sure that all your partners also get training. And so, because everyone who touches the lives of children and families in an area need to be doing consistently the same thing, or it fails. So they did partner. They developed a 101 training. They mandated it. They had a policy. There was resistance. Some people didn't want to go to it because of faith reasons. There are multiple things that happened. In addition, the people who did that initial training were mostly white and not representative of the diversity of the agency. That was something that later on they began to look at how to shift. But the other part that happens with training like that is that the people doing the training need to get some help as well after they get done, because of all the issues that come up in the way and pitch in which people react to the information being presented. But the purpose of the training 101 was, first of all, to have a common understanding and a common language among staff about what was going on and who these young people were and why it was important to be able to talk with them and engage with them. The second training, we would call 201, was to get closer into how can you engage and talk with young people. And across the board, first of all, in Allegheny County, consistently we heard from workers that we don't know we can't talk to young people about sexuality. That's not what we do. And we thought, well, wait a minute. Child welfare workers talk to everybody about a whole lot of sensitive stuff. What's the problem here? Maybe this is an Allegheny issue, but we soon found out that it was consistent across the board, and our assumptions caused us to step back and say, let's talk a little bit more with you about what you need, right? And really what the workers were saying they needed was hands-on practice and ways in which they could get coaching. So those kind of things had to be brought in by the system to help. I mean, there were staff that could do this, but there were majority of staff were challenged. But over time, as forms changed around how you assess and what kind of questions you ask, as tip sheets were developed, as experiences were given for folks to pilot talking with young people in their various roles, some progress was made in folks beginning to understand that you just need to have conversations with young people about what's going on in their life, that sort of stuff, to the place of where they become comfortable of having a relationship with you where they can talk and share and talk about what's going on with them. And it was also important for us to get an understanding for everybody who touches the lives of these young people to know who they are and how they identify and what their experiences were around faith, around the color of their skin, around race, around their sexual identity, and how they experience expressing themselves along a gender spectrum. Important because as you have conversations with young people and they begin to develop and trust you, when they come in upset about something, it's important to know what happened and what particular thing that day may have pissed them off and sent them over the edge. And also it's a way to ensure that they're safe and that the messaging they're getting, whether it's in a foster home or a group home or in an agency that's supposed to be helping them, is affirming them and ensuring that they don't re-traumatize them by the way in which they provide their services. You can go on. So next is affirming. You know, in the field, we've had evolution on our LGBT side of saying, well, we just need to get people to accept. You know, if they could just minimize being so hateful, my words, it could really get to the place of just being a little more accepting of us and tolerating us. That can really make a difference in how we feel about ourselves and the dangers that we may run into around internalizing and beginning to hate who we are. And sometimes for young people that results in some very negative things like cutting and suicidal ideation or attempts or suicide. And so we knew that by moving to accepting behaviors, there was evidence and research that said you could begin to mitigate some of those potential things that happen. But where we vision going is beyond accepting to affirming, to fully celebrating the young people and all the aspects of their identities, and to find ways in which to connect them, whether it's to family, to peer groups, to affirming faith-based groups, ways in which they have the experience of fully belonging and achieving that self-love about every aspect of who they are, and then beginning to understand how to navigate society every day when you walk out the door and experience microaggressions or overt aggressions, how to manage and how to move and how to thrive and how to achieve, and to have those places to fall back on for that support to get centered and to continue to be able to move and be successful. At 75 years old, I still would love to be able to call my mom and have her do her social justice reactions about something that I experience, and to have a sense of humor to make me laugh and kind of get through it and center myself. Or to talk to my dad, who I was blessed to have, who is from the Azore Islands and had a whole island culture that was very calming and different and could help me kind of just get balanced and manage through life. I mean, I was blessed with that, and I think all children should be blessed with that. That is what belonging, how do we get to belonging? And that is really relational permanence more than legal permanence in my perspective. So affirming enables young people to have social connections, peer supports. If spirituality and faith was a big part of their life, to get into affirming faith-based places where they get messaging around, yes, we are children of God, or however they believe, and we will be loved and in the next life, or whatever people believe. A healthy environment where they can have healthy identity formation, and success. So let's go to the next. Lastly, at the end of the day, it's really about love. And when we are loved unconditionally, which we should be, we are able to, as young people, begin to have conversations about love and sexuality and relationships and learn to navigate the world about who are friends, who are acquaintances, what is intimacy, what is love, what does it mean, to have conversations about all that. We, as part of our work in Allegheny County, would do what we call an institutional analysis, where we look at all aspects of an institution to see how change is actually happening and what the lived experience is of the people who experience the system. So we would have focus groups for young people, and I recall, and our whole team recalls, having a focus group with young people and asking about their experience and everything. And during the conversation in the focus group, they were talking about experiences they were having, walking back and forth to the group home and being hit on by these predators, and talking about their relationships and sexuality and all kinds of things. That the forum where we were asking questions enabled them to just have a conversation with each other they needed to do. And at the end of that focus group, which was very impactful for us, they said to us, "Thank you. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk. We're teenagers. We don't really know all this stuff." And it pointed to us the need for systems to have structures in place where young people can talk about all of this. Not only do we need to help them to love themselves and in turn to understand identity and why it's important and how it's important to love and to not get caught up in feeling bad about some aspect of themselves, but also how to navigate the world of becoming an adult and having healthy relationships and friendships, and not getting caught up in what they think are friends who are not, and the way in which folks can prey upon others to really be able to manage all of that. Really important for the young people that come to our systems, because they have been traumatized and harmed, and they are at high risk for all of those kinds of experiences. So in Allegheny County, we went through this. We did a lot of community meetings with different stakeholders to talk about it. I cannot tell you that they are now at a place where everybody is just kumbaya, having this wonderful system. We did say, if you're going to assess a prospective adoptive or foster parent, and you really want to be able to do this, as we think you should be asking questions about them about what they would do if they had a child who was 2 or 3 who insisted they were a boy and you thought they were a girl. What would you do if you adopted a child who at the age of 14 said, "I think I'm gay"? And if you said, "Oh, hell no, I would not have that, we'll take care of that and fix it," you really shouldn't be bringing them in as a foster parent. If they said, "Gosh, I don't know what I do, I try to get some help, that would be new to me," that's okay. We can work with that. That's also going to tell you what kind of supports in your system do you need to have to ensure that you have homes for young people that do what is needed to be done to have that outpouring of support and love that enables that belonging that we need. I will not tell you that that system or any system in the country is there, because we don't have enough foster homes. We have a history of contracting with faith-based folks because they are able to get us homes, and there are challenges around all of that and where our young people get placed and what we do. So there are big systemic issues that need to be thought about as we think about moving to a place where we can provide young people this getREAL approach. of achieving what we think they need. We have about 80 to 90 public and private child welfare folks involved in our network that we have provided information to and continue to. We've done webinars and lots of things like that. We've completed our work in Allegheny County. We are going to be providing an evaluation of that work and also a report on the results of the work that I've kind of described to you today more formally soon. We have a website that you can go in and get resources about the work that we do. And we have a partnership in California that Vida is the project manager for, which you will hear about along with the work of doing work with families.
Okay, so I'm going to take over for a little bit here and kind of center us on why this matters. And I really want to make, when I present the statistics, you know, people are like, oh no, not another set of data, not another set of statistics. But actually the statistics is very important, because that's when you look at it that you realize that we're talking about life and death. So when we're talking about kids in the United States, 22.8% of children in out-of-home care identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or questioning, okay? 57% of these youth are youth of color. So now we're talking about some of the youth that Bill talked about earlier on, right? When we're talking about the intersection of the different identities that each of these kids have. We also know that 1 in 5 young people in the US juvenile justice facilities identify as LGBTQ. 85% of these individuals are youth of color. Okay, I'm gonna let that sit for a second, 85%, okay. 12.9% of LGBTQ youth report being treated poorly by the foster care system, compared to 5.8% of non-LGBTQ youth. 70% of LGBTQ youth in group home report violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity. 100% report verbal harassment, okay? Of the 1.6 million of kiddos that we have on our streets in the United States, close to 50% identify as LGBTQ+, and they're on the street due to family rejection. And when they are rejected from their family and they end up in perhaps the child welfare system, they go back on the street, because for some of them it's better to be on the street than be in a foster home or a congregate or a group home that's going to be abusive to them and mistreat them. And 30% of LGBT youth in foster care report physical violence after disclosing their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, otherwise known as SOGIE. So those are pretty dark stats, and I'm going to continue with even darker. There was a 2019, published in 2020, study by the Trevor Project's National Survey on LGBTQ youth mental health. 40,000 LGBTQ youth were, across the United States were interviewed. These are direct stats from these kids, okay? Nearly 15% of LGBTQ respondents attempted suicide in the past 12 months, including more than 1 in 5 transgender or non-binary youth. Attempted suicide, not thought about it, they attempted to suicide, okay? 40% of LGBTQ youth and more than 50% of transgender and non-binary youth report having seriously considered attempted suicide in the past 12 months. 28% of LGBTQ youth who experienced housing instability reported suicide attempt in the past year. Again, attempt, not just thinking about it. 50% of transgender and non-binary youth didn't receive the wanted mental health care due to concern related to LGBTQ competence of providers. So they will not go to get the mental health that they need and deserve, because they're not sure that whoever is going to receive them is going to even know how to work with them. And the participants had also said that those that were close to them, particularly parents and caregiver, said that they would try to change their sexual orientation, with 35% saying that those persons were a parent or a caregiver. Okay, so again, I'm really presenting these because I want people to realize we're talking about life and death of the children that we have in our country. In contrast, from the very same survey, these same 40,000 kiddos said that transgender and non-binary youth who report having their pronouns respected by all or almost all people in their lives attempted suicide at half the rate of those who did not have their pronoun respected. Only 13% of youth who reported high level of support from family or friends or special person reported attempting suicide in the past year, compared to 22%. And finally, transgender and non-binary youth with access to binders, shapewear, gender-affirming clothing, allowed to groom the way they want, reported lower rates of attempted suicide in the past year compared to transgender and non-binary youth without access. So 13% compared to 26%. So again, we're talking really, really big numbers. This you can go and you can Google it. It's called the Trevor Project survey. It is a very, very wonderful survey. It is much longer than what I just presented, but it's really looking at the disparities of LGBTQ youth in our nation and the, obviously the prevalence of suicide and how dangerous situations are for these kids. So we really need to be thinking when we are in child welfare, when we are thinking that we have a worker in front of us who's saying, this is too confusing, I don't know what to use, they change their pronouns from one day to another, it's too much effort. It's really important that we talk about life and death, not about somebody's comfort or somebody, we need to provide training to the workers, and we need to say, listen, we're talking about life and death, and we have a do no harm policy in healthcare. We do no harm. And so if we do no harm, we've got to make sure that these kiddos are not attempting or thinking about attempting suicide. Hope that makes sense. So Bill talked about it earlier, that we really want to start thinking about all of these systems of oppression and how they are affecting our kids, the kids that we're working. We know that we have, that our systems take Black and brown children at a disproportionately high rate compared to white children. And they're reluctant to send them back to their families. There's always an excuse why we're not sending them back to their families. We also have structural racism in our system and LGBTQ stigma, which compound the problem and likely increase the risk that LGBTQ youth of color will enter the systems. And we're thinking about, when we're thinking about who we are and we're thinking about our white social workers going in and taking Black and brown children, that's what I'm talking about. And I'm being very, honest about that. We really need to be thinking about the experience of the families that we're entering, whether it's virtually or in person, obviously. But we need to be thinking about who they are, and we need to be inquiring about their experience with the system before we just go and take children away. We need to be thinking about what led them to where they are right now. Existing research find that LGBTQ youth of color are completely overrepresented in the child welfare and juvenile system. I've presented statistics, Bill talked about it earlier. Once in the system, these youth of color, LGBTQ youth of color, they tend to remain longer, and they face greater risk of discrimination. So think about these kids, think about transgender kid being in jails or being in juvenile justice system or in group homes. Think about what may happen to them. 1 in 5 young people in the US juvenile facilities identifies, I already said that, LGBTQ, and 85% are individual of youth of color. I've already presented that. And we have to think about the unjust treatment that they're receiving by the courts, by immigration, by the authority, law enforcement, reentry program, immigration authorities. We got to think about how our system is designed to not work for these children, and that our white supremacy system build, child welfare system build, takes heterosexism, anti-gay bias, which is the same as homophobia, anti-transgender bias, which is the same as transphobia. We don't call them phobias anymore, because the phobia is something you cannot control. So I have a phobia of spiders. I can't control that, okay? I get this sweats and everything, but we are now talking about anti-gay and anti-transgender, because a phobia is something you can't control, but being anti-gay or anti-transgender, you can control that, okay? There are ways of educating, there are ways of working on your bias to control that. So it's no longer a phobia. That's why we've changed the term, just a little FYI. So when we're talking about anti-racism, cultural humility, and LGBTQ youth, we really want to be thinking about the intersection of all these identities for our young folks and for our families, for that matter. We want to be thinking about the implication for youth of color with LGBTQ identities. What have their experience been from the time they were young, from the time they came out, from the time they were Black and brown? Guess what? From the time they were born, what their experience have been. And we want to honor all those. And these are not the only identities that these kiddos are going to present with. We are thinking also about cultural, religion, socioeconomic, being ableism and being able to maneuver the world in a way that we as privileged people may not realize how difficult it is. So we're thinking about all these oppression and all these systems who are piling onto these kids, and then they get to us, and how do we look at them? So a transgender Asian American young man may have a very, very different experience than a African American transgender young man, and we need to honor those, and we need to inquire about their experience as opposed to thinking we know how to work with them. And importantly, do not assume that a community will be more or less accepting of LGBTQ youth. Don't think that, oh, well, this community, yeah, I know they're not going to be accepting their kids. There's no way, they're way too religious. We recognize there are historical cultural reasons for why there might be additional fears or hesitance to accept LGBTQ identities in certain communities, but that doesn't mean that their fear or their resistance is going to make them completely not accept the children or the folks. We need to be working with them. We need to be working with compassion, and we need to be educating them. And we also need to be thinking that they love their children, and that's where we need to be starting. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Youth Acceptance Project. And the reason for that is the Youth Acceptance Project works with families who have LGBTQ plus children. And we work in making sure whether we're reunifying or we work in prevention, if we can, with families so that the children don't end up outside the family. So what can we do with families so that they accept and affirm their children? So our theory of change is that early sensitive engagement and intervention with families can support change that made a significant impact on families' functioning and a lasting impact on the overall wellness of LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer questioning, transgender, gender expansive, intersex youth. And actually, I can add many more letters to that, but LGBTQ plus when we're thinking about it in a more grand scheme. So we're going to show a video, a short video, but the basic of our model is that we have to enter in a relationship with a family and meeting the family where they are at. We can't enter the family and say, you need to be affirming of your child today. You need to stop doing this. You need to stop doing that. Just like we've told them from the beginning, every time we enter their home, they need to stop doing this. They need to stop doing that. They're not doing something right. We have to stop doing this. We have to build relationships with family first and understand who they are. So I'm going to ask that as you watch this little clip, that you really watch the reaction of the mom, the reaction of the person as well, and jot some notes on that, and we can talk about it when we come back. So let's see if this is going to work the way we want it to work. So it will take a few minutes to load, and if mine doesn't load, then we have it. Corina will have it. So here we go.
Vida?
Yes.
I don't know if it's connection or Zoom, but it's pixelating in and out.
Okay.
Now for this screen, it's, oh, well, maybe.
Try to see if you can you see this, or should you take over?
You can, but it's still, I think, does it look
okay.
like
Can you take over then and show the video?
Sure, yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm glad you did. So when it starts, you start at 10 minutes and 15 seconds.
Okay, we'll see if that will.
Okay. Sorry, folks, technology is a great thing, and sometimes it works a little less.
Sorry, just trying to get us back.
So, well, we go back to the PowerPoint. How's, and you can feel free to put it in the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself. What did you observe? What did you observe the mom when her child was coming out to her? When you wrote, love the supportive auntie. Yes, and we're going to be talking about that in a second. Absolutely. Fear, yes. Yes, you observed fear. Yep. Lots of layers, a range of emotion, absolutely. It's complicated, someone wrote. Yes, it's definitely complicated. Fear for her daughter's safety. Absolutely, fear for her daughter's safety. Yes. Shame, looking around to see if anyone was listening. Absolutely. Good catch. Guilt, as if she did something wrong. Yes. Somebody wrote, I saw myself when my child told me. Thank you for sharing that with us. Mom got defenses when looking all around in case other heard the conversation, worried about what others think. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and so somebody said, I love the aunt's reaction. Can you say a little more about that? Oh, I lost my chat box. Where's my chat box? Here it is. She had negative language like, what's the problem? Yeah. Fear life would be harder than it's already being black. Yes. Not accepting humor help when stressed. Yes. When told. Yes. So you're all exactly where Auntie had a celebratory tone. The auntie seemed happy for her. Yes. So we'll talk a little bit. The auntie was really there to hold mom and to let her know you did nothing wrong, right? So when we're talking about working with our families, we've got to think about who else in the family is there. We're not there to fix these families. There's nothing to fix. We want to see who is the network of support. This mother in particular, who does she have around her that can support her through this? In this case, she was her sister. Her own sister was right there. Auntie rejoiced about the thing to be proud of. Yes, absolutely. So it's really important that we think about that we think about who. We want to ask the youth, who do you have in your life that loves you for who you are? Who do you think that your mother or parent or whoever, caregiver, uncle, grandfather, whoever it is that's in your life right now that's not accepting, who do they have in their life that could help them and support them through this? So we really, when we're talking about the Youth Acceptance Project, one of the things that we do is we do a 16-hour clinical training. And one of the things that we really talked in extensively is about grief. So when you think about a parent who just finds out, to allow them to be where they're at, to allow them to experience the grief of their child coming out, the loss of gender-specific parenting dreams, loss of the boy or the girl they previously parented or they thought they were parenting, perhaps loss of faith. What if they go to church and the church is not accepting of who they are and they don't want their child to be there? What's the parent going to do? Do they continue where they're at, or are they going to go look for another church? It's not that easy. You don't just get up and say, okay, let me go find another place to worship. Loss of relationships, of community. What if people find out? What are we going to do? And then loss of privilege, believe in a just world. When she says it's hard, it's hard enough to be a Black woman in this world. I don't want this to be harder. You can see the genuine fear in her face. And so it's important that when we are building relationship with these families, we listen to where they're at. Now, it's not saying that it's okay for them to be abusive or to be discriminatory or to kick we're not saying that at all. But what we're saying, though, is that in order to move a family, from what Bill talked about, it's not just about accepting, but it's about affirming. We first have to listen to where they're at and listen and validate their feelings. And just like we saw in this video, the fear that this mother was experiencing, fear that her child is going to experience rejection from the world. She doesn't want that. The last thing she wants is for her child to hurt. Thinking that parents are she's going to be judged as having failed. She wasn't good enough. She didn't parent properly. The ambiguity, the fear of making the wrong decision. What's going to happen now? What are we going to do? what, you know, if I do one thing or do another, it might hurt my child, or it might hurt me, or it might hurt my family. And then thinking that the child or even the entire family will be physically unsafe. So fear of consequence of going against a family, against a church teaching, or just being in the community with their child, and how that's going to be impacting the family. And also how the siblings are impacted, right? So when one child becomes the center of conflicts, let's say, all the other siblings kind of fall behind. And how is that going to affect them? So you're going to have the really affirming siblings, best case scenario, and you're going to have younger siblings or even other siblings who are like, I'm tired of having, you know, my brother or sister, or being, you know, the one that's always everybody focuses on. So we got to think about how it affects the entire family, not just one person in the family. And then, as we saw, the guilt that mom was experiencing, so things they wish they could say, unsay, or undo. Wish that things were different. We always hear from families in our clinical work that family says, why us? Why me? Why now? Things are complicated enough. We didn't need this, you know. And then we have families who are going to become suddenly very uncomfortable discussing sex and sexuality, and how to normalize that for them, and how to get to a point where we build enough of a relationship that we can tell them that sexuality is very separate from behavior, and it's very separate from who their child is, you know. When we have you know, when a family has a child who identifies cisgender and straight, they may not feel comfortable discussing sexuality with their child. That's one thing. But if they do, and they find out their child is gay, things might be different for them. Maybe because they can't relate, or for whatever other reason, the things they've heard that happens. So we have to be there for our families. And then the embarrassment that they may be feeling. And, you know, it hits us in a different way, particularly those of us who are workers, who have working indirectly in the field, who are also part of the LGBTQ community. We have to be thinking very intentionally on how, when we enter those families and we hear, not enter the family, I'm sorry, enter the home of these families, how we hear these things, how it's going to trigger us as part of the community. And it's important for us to have someone that we can go to, and to our supervisor go to, and talk about these things, because we still need to be there for that family to move them along the spectrum to being affirming of their children. So we also build in the curriculum and in the training, we build hope, because really what it is, it's families having hope for their children. All families love their children, and we just got to make sure that they remember that there's plenty of hope. And hopefully with the connection that we as an agency or an organization, as we build relationship with these families, we can build some trust and a connection where we can actually work with them through their fear, their guilt, their shame, and we can bring them to affirm their child. When we're talking about faith, I really talk about leaning in. Some of us are more comfortable talking about faith than others, and that's okay. I, for myself, am not very comfortable, so I let some of my coworkers do that for me. But it's really important that faith is a support and not a barrier. And it is really important that we find the many faith groups and communities in the United States who are affirming, and it's important that we connect our parents with them, or perhaps we connect the leader of their church with the leader of those church, right? And they can have the conversations. We want to utilize the tenets of faith as an entree towards creating acceptance toward their child. God loves all children. We can hold both faith and love for their child. It's not a threat to religious commitment, and faith can help them carrying out through the conflicts. But again, I'm going to urge you that if you're not comfortable with that you bring a coworker, or you go and speak perhaps to a faith leader that can help you with this, or can actually engage the family themselves. And like I said, nationwide, there are many affirming faith communities. You can Google them very easily. And just quickly, the element of youth acceptance project. Families love their children. Do not assume someone cannot change. I've heard so many like, oh, they're old school. Oh, they'll never change. They're super religious. Their culture will never allow it. No, that is not true. we have had tremendous success. We train clinicians, and we make sure that these clinicians are supported. Our clinicians are home-based and family-centered and strength-based. And they're designed to increase family understanding and affirmation and ultimately preserve or reunify youth with their family. We don't want family in systems. We don't want kids in group homes. We don't want kids in foster care. We want kids with their families. That's where they are loved, and that's where they want to be. So we have to believe we can do this for them. We provide emotional support. We improve communication between the parent and youth. We provide accurate information about SOGIE to family member. And it doesn't have to be just the parents. It can also be many other people in the child's life. It could be whoever the child wants around. You know, who else do you have in your life you'd like, we need to talk to? People at school, extended family, friends. We go to the school, we support them, and we advocate for them at school. We educate the school personnel. We refer parents to appropriate resources. There are many, many resources in the United States that we can refer parents to. And then we also provide, when a child is already out of home, unfortunately, then we provide training to Candy or group home staff, because that's really important. And then ultimately what we do is we want the child to be at home. Like I said, and I said it several times. And finally, what I want to tell you is that we are seeing a reduction in self-harm and suicide, which is what I started with. Youth are feeling affirmed and families are feeling supported. We're keeping children and their families together. We're unifying families, and we're seeing a lot less running away. So when we start working with the family and the child, and we can hold both of them together, and take them through this journey together, the children start not to run as often. Staying at home is becoming more enjoyable for them, and less discriminatory, and less abusive, in less abusive homes. So it's really important that, again, this is really that we focus on spending time and building relationship with the families, so we can get to the point where we can educate them about their child and show them that they can love their child, and their child is exactly who they were before coming out. So Bill, I think I'm going to, okay, I'm going to talk briefly about the impact of COVID-19 on LGBTQ youth, and then I'm going to give it to you back, Bill. What's happening right now with our youth is isolation is one of the biggest factor that is really creating a lot of stress for our LGBTQ youth. Social distancing, as you know, can worsen depression, anxiety. Some of our kiddos may be at home where caregivers were not supportive of them or affirming of them, and maybe even abusive. So we have to be very careful about what's happening to our kiddos. We've got to make sure that we remember to reach out to them. A lot of our clinicians are developing great ways to communicate with children without outing them, you know, so that we've got to think outside the box. A lot of our LGBTQ and gender expansive kiddos used to get support at school. They're no longer, for those who can't go to school, they're not getting that. They have to think about their safety at home, possibly with family members. So we really need to be thinking about all these factors when you're thinking about COVID-19 and the kids who are stuck at home. We also have a high rate of homelessness. So of course, when they can't be at home, they end up on the street. And we've talked about that earlier. And think about the kiddos who don't have access to healthcare. What if there was a transgender child who was in the middle or is in the middle of getting some treatment and now can't access the treatment? How is that going to impact their health, whether it's physical health or mental health? And really, we can't really replace in-person treatment and interaction with a community that accepts and validates these children's identity. So we really need to be thinking outside the box on how we're going to be working with our families. So it's that much more important that we work with the families so they can be safe at home. So having said that, Bill, I'm gonna.
Okay, thank you, Vida. And so coming back to some of the stuff we've talked about earlier, we believe that how institutions are organized directly impacts practice. So we have gone in and looked at systems through our racial equity work at the Center for the Study of Social Policy who say they are doing innovative things and have put things in place that appear to be. But when we go and talk to the young people and the families that are served, the lived experience they describe to us indicates it's the same to them. That's their perspective. And that says a lot about the importance of having a framework that pays attention to that, that understands the history of our country, the history of systemic oppression, and has a very dedicated, authentic approach to looking at the structural barriers to effectively serving all the young people who are impacted by stigma and oppression in the families and communities. And the pandemic, the COVID pandemic that Vida referenced that we are all living through, and I would say the political pandemic, the impact of the murder of George Floyd, the awareness in the country and globally about racism and oppression, the negative impact on people of color with the COVID-19 pandemic, all of that has put us in a place in this country to really take a look at who we really are. Baldwin always said, until America accepted the lie, change would not happen. And I believe that hopefully we are getting a more universal awareness of who our country is, what we are now. And we can begin to think about who do we want to be, which I think is the critical point we're in right now. Next. So I would say after a gazillion years of trying to transform systems that we really can't transform them to the place we want them to be, because of categorical funding, shifts in the economy, mandates, legislation that goes back and forth between family preservation and the incentives for adoption, all of the things that happen that are out there. And the fact that our schools are underfunded, our systems are not funded in the way they should. We often have our systems handing off problems, thinking someone else can take it, it's their problem, not ours. Schools referring to CPS because of situations that they're not able to do. And while we can do work to make things better so that the systems do better, ultimately it's not going to solve the core problems of why we have what we have. And so there is a movement going on across the country, which we call abolition. There's a prison abolition movement that is far ahead of most of the movement around abolition. There's the defund the police movement, which gets characterized differently than often than what it's intended to do. The movements for abolition are, from my perspective, recognizing that what systems do now is to respond to what to do when things get bad. And we do the best we can with that. But where we need to go is to say, what is it we need to do to make all of our communities flourish? And to have a perspective that we continuously work on what to do to continue to get things better rather than where we are now, which is after the fact, dealing with abuse that may have occurred and predominantly neglect, which is tied very much to poverty and to oppression. So we are now at the Center for the Study of Social Policy in partnership with the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston, launching the upEND movement, which from our perspective is our intention as more traditional agencies to build a movement of folks across the country who believe that we have to address the core problems. And in order to address the core problems, we have to abolish the child welfare system as we know it. That may sound radical, but when I was child welfare director, I always said if we were really doing our work right, we would get to a place of putting ourselves out of business, you know. But obviously the systems cannot end child abuse and neglect. The core problems exist in the way in which our history has brought us to this place. And so when we talk about belonging and communities and people and individuals really having that belonging, we're talking about all of us having the equal right to create and make to co-create and make the demands upon society for reimagining who we are and what we want to be. When all communities are thriving and all folks are getting the kinds of support and resources and love poured into them, only then can we get to a place of a new way of looking at how we achieve child, family, and community well-being. That's a huge long-term vision. And when we talk about abolishing the child welfare system, we're not talking about tomorrow, let's end it. We're talking about getting child welfare systems collectively to say, we are going to join this movement. We get it. Our vision should be to move to abolition. And the road to abolition means that we should make a concerted effort collectively to pay attention to how we remove the structures and barriers that exist while we participate in a collective movement of reimagining what we want our communities to look like across this country. That's what we're talking about. I, as a person who went into child welfare, came in as a social worker wanting to make a difference. And I soon found I was in a place where I really couldn't do the kind of social work I thought I was going to come in and do. And I know that over the years, I saw that happen all the time. There are all of you probably right now that we're talking to who do amazing work. And the purpose of this movement is to get to a place where you can do that work free of the structural barriers and other kinds of things that prevent you from being able to effectively do that with families and children in communities. So we really want to encourage you to think about participating in a symposium we're doing on October 20th and 21st. You can go to upendmovement.org to register for it, where we're going to begin to talk about what we're talking about here in greater depth with panels. And it's the very beginning of our moving to a place where we believe upending will help us to end up with a place where everybody is belonging and we can end the othering, the race, all of the othering we all really want to get rid of. Until we say we could do that, it's not going to happen. But we believe we can make it happen. And maybe not in my lifetime, but I hope it gets launched and gets traction and gets moving. I really do think we have an opportunity right now. We're at a point in time where we're going to go one way or the other, and I hope this is the way we go. I think we're moving to questions now, right? And our websites are up there for you.
Yes, this is Nora, and I have a question that was asked earlier in your presentation. Does getREAL propose any solutions that prevent youth from entering the system?
No, getREAL, it did not get to the place of prevention. We got to the place of what to do with the young people coming in. I think that the work Vida talked about around the Youth Acceptance Project and working with families is part of our collaboratives work that ties into getREAL. But getREAL was first and foremost to kind of get systems to do a better job of the young people coming in. Obviously, we hope we can get there, but that was the real initiative of getREAL, and we certainly got to a place where in Allegheny County, with a lot of the focused work we did, courts were much more knowledgeable about medical issues, much more respectful of names and pronouns. It was a dramatic shift. There were contracts that were put in place with clear accountability mechanisms to make sure that service providers were doing a better job than they had been. The group homes that existed in Allegheny County, the children's attorneys told us they finally had some places where the young people were going and getting affirmed and supported. So a lot of work still need to be done there, but ours was much more focused on in the system rather than prevention.
We have no other questions at this time. If anybody would like to enter a question in the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question, please feel free to go ahead and do that.
And I'll provide, while we're waiting for folks, maybe if you're thinking of